Am I on?
Not live yet. We can hear you. Just let us know when that thing actually goes live.
Okay, it is.
Okay.
All right, you're good to go.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you slept well. I didn't, but I'm going to rise to the occasion. Thank you very much for to everyone who made a comment on Instagram or Facebook. I appreciate it very much. First thing I'm going to do today is confuse you, and I hope you find that edifying. I'm going to take a whole bunch of liquid here and
Microphone off. Hold on. Go back to your audio. Say something there, click on. Sure. Yeah, it's already. Yeah, say something negative about it.
I'm going to show you something that may surprise you, and then we'll see what happens. Carry on?
Yep.
This is ultramarine with a whole bunch of liquid. I just unfortunately got a little yellow in it, which I don't want, but we'll pretend that didn't happen. This is a cheap brush from the hardware store. We call it a chip brush. This is a lot of liquid with it.
From your mic.
And I'm just going to put it over the picture. If this, the other painting from yesterday is entirely dry, if I were a quick layer of retouch varnish on it before I did this will work fine. This is to show you that if we got the values right yesterday, that we could decide all of a sudden to make this into moonlight without any problem. One of the things in moonlight is that generally color disappears. So if we get a similar tone everywhere, that will give us some sense of moonlight. Yes. This is just liquid and ultramarine. You could easily do it with indigo, but most of the indigo brands I know are more opaque, so you have to be a little more delicate about the way you put it on. But that's how we might very well start on a moonlit painting. You might want to try and get rid of some of these brush strokes, or at least make them go with the contours of the thing that you're painting. In this situation, because it's moonlight, we would then darken the masses some so that the whole sense of the picture were darker. I've shown you that because we're not actually going to do that today. But I just wanted to show you that we could. I'm going to take some liquid, which is also a pretty good eraser, and I'm going to get back to where I think this picture is going to go. But remember that once you've done that grisaille, you have all the forms and most of those decisions made, so you can play with it and you can make it any time of the night or day that you wish. That may seem a strange concept, but as you're painting on it, you may say, oh, that looks like afternoon light, or that looks like an early morning on an overcast day, or whatever. But once you have all this down, it's pretty easy to change it. So that's the end of the moonlight, which sounds as though it could be part of a song, I think. I better clean this up a little bit. The colors that are on here are all ones that were on the list that I believe the subscribers got. Starting down in this corner, This is Michael Harding Naples Yellow. The one next to it is a Michael Harding that's called Genuine Naples Yellow, and you can see they're not the same color, which I find a little confusing, but that's all right. This guy is Transparent Orange Oxide, which is a Rembrandt. This is Becker's Naples Yellow, which is the Swedish color, which is hard to get. I did find that I could get in touch with a retail store in Stockholm and they would send it to me. So we would at one stage order it in a big group for a bunch of us, and it was reasonably cost effective. Yellow Ochre, Brownish Madder, Vermilion, Burn Umber, Ultramarine, Alizarin Crimson, Cobalt Blue, Michael Harding King's Blue Deep, Old Holland Violet Gray, Holbein Composed Green, Holbein Green Gray, somebody's Cinnabar Green, I don't remember, Old Holland Cadmium Green Light, Sap Green, and our Prussian Green from yesterday. I probably would not have put those all out if I'd made all the decisions about what this was going to look like, because it doesn't give me a lot of palette room left, but we'll work with this nonetheless. Now I have something all over my hand, which is nice. You might like this. I don't want that liquid in the middle, so I'm just going to get rid of it. One thing that a friend of mine, I don't know if it was she who invented it, but I got the idea from her. This is liquid in a tube. You can get empty tubes from art material suppliers and just fill it with whatever you want. If you find you use a reduction of ultramarine and white for skies as a starting place, you can easily pre-mix it and put it in a tube, and you don't have to then mix it and use up your palette. If you're painting outside, obviously palette room is an issue, but we'll see how we do. I hope you all went out and bought your Scott brand towel because I said so. Most people don't like it because it's not absorbent, which is exactly why I do like it. So here's a rosemary brush. It's not pristine. It's a little stiff because I'm not good at cleaning my brushes, but I get used to them being like that. So I'm going to take, in this case, some Prussian green, and it's pretty thin with liquid, and I'm going to put it on top of this mound here. One of the good things that happens if you've done it, started earlier in the day and you're outside and so it's dried, or if you've painted on this yesterday and can then come back today, is that you can put that color on top of there and still have all of the irregularities from the brush strokes before. I like that. I tend to paint in layers, which is not always exactly congenial with painting out of doors because it doesn't necessarily dry fast enough. But there's a green start for you. Now a little bit of transparent orange oxide, which I'm going to put in here. And you can see all of this is going on really thinly, so I can keep all of those marks underneath. I'm a little less scared of the camera today than I was yesterday, but I'm not entirely over it. It's a little strange if I'm in a workshop and I try and crack one of my jokes, at least I can hear if people are laughing. And of course, here there's dead silence. And it's just very slightly creepy. Because I'm sure you're laughing. We're going to see if it turns out to be Utah, which it tried to be yesterday, or Carolinas, or the Lake District. Who knows? I am not very good, by the way, in case you haven't realized that, about telling you what color I'm using, because I'm mixing colors into colors, and so I don't really have any idea what it is. But I know you can see my palette, so maybe you'll know what it is. This is ultramarine mixed into stuff that was there. When you're painting from your head, one of the things you have to obviously try to deal with is a consistent sense of light. And the only trick I know of to think about that, at least in light direction, is to pretend that if you want, that you have in fact a flashlight that you're holding up like this, and you just think to yourself, okay, it'll hit this, that'll cast a shadow, it won't hit that, and it's the only way I can actually visualize it. Just so I won't embarrass myself, I won't hold my hand up like that, but that's what I'm thinking. As you can see, this is still very thin beginning of local color. We're going to get to opaque paint on this pretty soon. But I just want something everywhere to paint into. If you're thinking about having a career painting in front of cameras, I would suggest you don't do it. It's very unforgiving. As I said yesterday, this panel is so heavy that it's taxing the hinge on my Edge Pro, but it's holding up. Albert Camus in L'Étranger said, "A man's life is nothing but a slow trek to rediscover, through the detours of art, those 2 or 3 great and simple images in whose presence his heart first opened." And I think even if we don't realize it, we're trying to recapture that first time when our eyes opened and we said, wow, and realized that someone had connected with our imagination. I've told the story that when I was very little, there was not a lot of air conditioning, and in the summertime, when it was really hot and humid, and my sister and I couldn't fall asleep, my parents would take us out in a family convertible at night with the top down. We would lie down on the back seat, and they would drive us around until we were cool enough and until we fell asleep, which was certainly a good tactic. But what happened as a consequence of that is I would be lying on the back seat, and I would be looking up, and what I saw is the trees meeting overhead, and the sky in between them, and then the trees would move. And I think it was the first time I really thought outside of myself and started really thinking about something like that. I have never painted that view, but surprisingly, after all of this time, it stays very much with me, that experience. We would wind up cool enough, we'd get home, and as parents know, we would be sound asleep, we could be carried up without even awaking, and I would just remember the next day that we had done this. But so there's a little color everywhere. Maybe a little more down here. You also, if you watched yesterday's, realize that I'm not very wedded to a particular time of day when I start this. And for that matter, I'm not really wedded to a particular place. But now we have to make a specific place that works, and everything has to work together and surprisingly all be on the same day, which can be a real problem doing this. You had to pay a lot of attention about whether or not everything works with the other things to be on the same day. Now I'm taking some of the Prussian green and I'm putting it over the thin wash of Prussian green I had. It's a little bit thicker. I appreciate the questions that people had yesterday, and certainly feel free to write in your questions because they're fun for me to answer and it allows me to think about what you're thinking about. I have a question.
About liquid. Have you had any problems with the skin irritation with liquid? Have you used gloves?
I haven't, and I've now used it for maybe 35 years or so, and I suppose it would have developed by now. Though I did know someone who used it for a long time and then all of a sudden they had a reaction to it and couldn't use it at all, but that was more respiratory than skin. The demonstration I did for you yesterday, if I'd gone, I was in the studio and I'd gone straight from the beginning to where we left it yesterday, it probably, instead of being 3 hours, would have been about an hour and a quarter. But it will surprise you to know that when I'm in the studio, I'm not actually explaining it to myself, which makes it last longer. I don't know if you can begin to see yet the emergence of forms in this, a little more volume in some things. Although I could make you guess where the light's going to come from, in fact it's going to come from up here, but the sun's going to be reasonably low. In addition to my new friends here, I have a couple of older friends, not old in age, but of longer term here, and they're going to attempt to heckle me, and I'm not going to look in their direction. But just know this is happening to me. So, the water went behind there yesterday. I think we'll still do that. So this is going to be a little darker and a good deal more definite than what I've painted so far today. I don't want that to stop coincident with that tree trunk, so I've got to go a little bit beyond it. I'm not sure I remember what that was, but I think it originally was a tree. I'm going to take some sap green now and put it on this meadow that we had up here, that we got just by wiping out some of the background. This may not be its ultimate color, but it's to remind me that it's there. So if that's a meadow, then the trees immediately behind it have bottoms and a side towards us which are going to be darker. I'm going to go to a smaller brush in a minute, by the way. You have to also, in addition to thinking about colors working together and the light being on the same day, you have to think about your scale. Because you can say, oh, I'm making a wonderful tree, and realize that the tree is 350 feet tall and that it can't be there. I rather like this thing as a tree, but unless I change the scale of the entire thing, that tree is just going to be too big. Let's use a different brush now. I was rather reluctant to have Simi from Rosemary Brushes look at the condition of my brushes. This one is a brand new one. In the beginning I couldn't replace brushes very often, and so I learned to like them at all their various stages as I destroyed them. But let's see. These trees all have tops, they have sides, they have little things happening between them. And this is just very calligraphic. I'm not describing particular trees, but I'm making enough commotion that I hope the viewer will fill in that it's a whole bunch of trees. Each one of these things, of course, will be affected by the next thing, and sometimes things have to be darkened. For example, under here, I want now that to be darker than I had it before. And what I've just done there, that's probably going to be too dark, but what I've just done is a mixture of ultramarine and alizarin crimson, which is how I make my darkest dark. This is perhaps a little redder than I will want it to be. We're going to let this one be a big tree. So it needs to have a bottom, and given the way I think I'm going to light it, it's going to cast some shadows in that direction. What that is, I don't know, but for the moment, it's a destination for your eyes. Probably saw yesterday, I do squint almost the entire time that I'm painting. And I was telling folks here this morning that I went to the eye doctor in my early 40s just because I was supposed to be a grown-up and realize that I was probably going to need glasses, and which I do now use for reading. But I said to him, I squint when I paint, and he said, oh, we can fix that. But he didn't realize I didn't want him to fix that, that was intentional. If you know my paintings at all, you know I like to make marks that stand for things without necessarily entirely drawing them. So as these things go away on this hill, they become less distinct, but there's still marks that tell that there's more than one thing there. Up here we're going to have some light hitting up in here. I don't want to go into a lot of light color at the moment, but I'm thinking about the fact that this flank of that mountain is going to be lit, which means that on this side there are going to be some cast shadows, or at least places where the sun does not get. Yes.
Linda Nielsen's asking, do you use a final varnish or do you use liquid as a final varnish?
I use a final varnish, and the one I use is a Winsor Newton one. It's I don't know actually what it's called, but I think it's alkyd in the same way that liquid is, so they play well together. But and I use a gloss varnish. That can be a problem when pictures are hung opposite windows, if you want to see them during the daytime. But I love the way it makes things richer. I also use their retouch varnish sometimes in between. Had I been in the studio, I probably would have come in this morning and given this a spritz of retouch varnish, which would have shown me what the relative value relationship was better than just the dried paint. So just like yesterday, I'm still describing form, or trying to, by making marks that are somewhat random. If one of you wanted to, you could write in and say that's working beautifully. We're not worrying about the top of this tree. I'm not positive the tree is going to stay. We were talking about it this morning, and this tree makes a turn right here. And with a tree that you would find in nature, it would be making that turn because it was avoiding the shadow of another tree nearby, and there is no other tree. On the other hand, if you make that straight up like a telephone pole, it's not very interesting. We did have this little shadow yesterday, so everybody who was paying attention might have said, oh, I know what he's going to do. I can't remember if it's Rapunzel who let her hair down for her escape. Might be, but in any event, this could be some kind of a ruined fortification from some other time, which might take us out of Utah immediately. One of my hosts here is Michael Klein, who is homesick. So you might want to send him good wishes and perhaps some contributions toward his continuing care. He only has a cold, but still.
We just had a comment come in from a Stephanie Neely saying that's working beautifully.
Ah, thank you, Stephanie. Stephanie lives down here in the south, I know that. But I think maybe Georgia. I lived for a while in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and people up north said, oh, you live down south, and people in the south thought, that's not really the south. Joe, you might write down that Stephanie said that so we can send her one of the free paintings.
Lolly Shearer has asked if you're using an ivory round.
I am, and it is, I have no idea what that says. What does it say, Joe? 0?
Yes.
Okay, it's a 0. I find not being able to really see this is a help for me, because I will, in fact, make better large masses because I'm not fixated on the details. I think when we light this area in here, we're going to get some echoes of it up in here. So stay tuned for that. Generally speaking, I use not this small, but I use very small brushes to paint very large canvases. I don't know why that's the case, but I'm never somebody who started with big brushes and then continued to refine it and then use smaller brushes. All these somewhat random marks will ultimately contribute to a sense that there's a good deal of complexity which is there because of the marks, but it's not, each part is not necessarily terribly thought out, but in the aggregate they become more complex. If you don't want your feed to be cut off, you might ask a question.
We've just had one come in from Bruce Erickson.
Uh-huh.
It says, I'm intrigued by the fact that you seem to be using only one brush for the various colours and values with a wipe, the non-absorbing Scott towel. Can you get away with this because the paint is so thin? Have you always worked that way?
I have always worked this way because, as most of you know, I was not properly trained, and so I just figured it out as I went. When I see people painting with 6 brushes in their offhand, I think, isn't that wonderful? But I would never remember to change the brushes. So I got used to sort of mixing it all together. Plus, I want a color with little bits of shift, but with some of this basic color in it, so that there is some consistency at the moment. The mess that's here in the middle is rather like a sourdough starter.
Peter Yesus has asked, how many paintings do you have going at one time in the studio?
If they're big paintings, I could have as many as 8 if I'm painting for a show, sometimes actually even more. And I'll take something down because I think, oh yes, that's what I can do to that. And because I'm painting so often out of my head, it's nice sometimes for them to sit around and mature a little while I think about something else. If I'm painting small paintings like this, I usually do one at a time. I have a brush roll that I decided finally I'd be a grown-up and have that instead of having loose brushes in my kit when I'm out in the field. And just about that time, I had a large painting on my in my studio, and it was hanging from nails from the ceiling, and it slipped off. It was at 30 by 60 inch, so that's what, 75 by 150 centimeters, and it fell off and landed on the corner of a chair, which gave it a huge rip, larger than was going to be reparable. And so I had a studio friend, after I'd cut a little piece out of it, sew it onto my brush roll. So on here, there's a little Donald Jurney of a tent sewn on by my friend, and that's the only part of that huge painting that was really salvageable. So I'm going to turn this flank of the mountain slightly towards me as a way of getting it in shadow, so that's what I'm doing now, which will make this more of a little pocket of light ultimately. You notice that I have done nothing about the sky, and unlike some painters, I often do the sky at the end. And when I'm painting out of my head, it's easier for me to make the sky be on the same day with the painting after I've decided what the painting is going to be, rather than making the sky and then trying to get everything consonant with that. I think I told you yesterday that I often make up stories, so I'm thinking about the time when there was that terrible rock slide here and you could hear it for 30 miles away. I actually didn't mind yesterday when people wrote in and said that I should be institutionalized. They're not the first people.
Tim Giles has just written in saying, just to let you know I'm laughing with you.
Oh, good. Thank you, Tim.
Not at you. But he says, seriously, I like the resulting vibration from the layers of small brushstrokes.
Ah, great. That is the intention. And this part is really fun to do because it's It doesn't have any rules, and what I'm trying to do is just make a commotion, which I do a lot even when I don't have a brush in my hand. But we already have more form than we had when we started today. I'm going to use a little bit larger brush now. Let's see. This is a middle-aged rosemary brush, and it's a number 2. I think I may have said yesterday that at one stage I used rosemary mongoose brushes, which are absolutely beautiful, but I am so hard on brushes that they were unwilling to put up with my nonsense. And so I had to go to something that had a little more resilience, which these certainly do. The mongoose brushes, if you paint finely, are just exquisite tools. I think if I were a figure painter, and particularly if I were painting flesh, that I would really love them. I'm holding the flashlight up as I do this. There's the heart monitor again. On large canvases, I almost always paint on stretch canvas. It's the same canvas that's on these boards, which is Clausen 13 single primed. And I've painted on it for a very long time, and so I know exactly how it's going to react. One nice thing about painting on stretch canvas, especially if you're painting for a show, is that because there's a little bit of bounce, even if you stretch it very tightly, you can often come up with 2 brush strokes for the price of 1 because the brush is still there, it goes on, it comes back and gets some more paint. So if you're under a deadline, you might think about that. I know at least one person who's watching from Norway at the moment, and I think it must be nice to be sitting on a couch someplace with a beer or a glass of wine, just watching me do this. I hope you're getting to see some emerging form while we're doing this. I'm doing this. Here I have to be careful about the fact I didn't really leave a reflection for this thing, for Rapunzel's tower. So I have to be careful that I don't drag too much color into that. We might, Joe, get some suggestions about what that should be, given its size, if somebody wants to write in and give me some instructions. This is when I'm supposed to say, work with me, people. So we're going to go smaller again for a minute. See what we can do over in this mess over here. There was a whole bunch of stuff that was light colored at the top there, which I seem to have painted out today. At this stage, I probably, since the liquid is still wet, I can probably get some of that back. And I may decide to do that. The light's going to come across this way, so it's going to hit this bank.
Leslie Hawes has just written in and just said, it's Scotland. And that's it.
There you are. See? And my mother was a MacLeod, so it could well be. Though it's a little forested in here, but it could be one of those plantations of softwood trees, which are a good idea. And when I came across them in Wales, though, I thought they are so regular. And after a while, they get rather tedious to look at, even though they have a good environmental reason.
Gloria Smith's written and saying, this is looking like someone's secret place and you've discovered it. Beautiful.
Well, there you are. I like that. Send that woman a free painting too, please.
Bruce has said, I see a mill-type structure, perhaps a water wheel.
Well, when Bruce buys this from me, he can put that water wheel in, but I won't be able to make it round properly, so. I hope you are getting a sense of complexity in all these marks, as if that's some kind of vegetation. My two invited hecklers are not saying anything, which is rather a surprise to me.
We've just had someone else say maybe an old mill.
Well, those people get no painting. I can only be led so far.
Good question from Madeline. She says, I'd like to hear more about how you think light. Are there any rules that you have to use/obey? And what discoveries, experience, ideas are your inventions made upon?
That's a rather complex question, Madeline. Tell me again the first part about light.
Are there any rules that you use or obey?
I'm not very good at obeying while painting or in any other way, so I don't think we can use obey, but we know that this light is going to travel in a straight line, and so that's sort of the point of the flashlight, so that we can just begin to imagine where it lands. The second part was what?
Second part was, what discoveries, experience, ideas are your inventions made upon?
Well, of course, the real answer to that is that a lifetime of looking, even when I didn't know I was looking relative to paintings, which is not a very satisfactory answer, I know. I don't, except if I'm painting on a workshop, I don't often go out looking for motifs, but I constantly, of course, am gathering information even when I'm not thinking about it. I've done a lot of traveling. I've painted a lot of places in the world. I guess a lot of them inform my work in ways that it would be hard for me to put my finger on, but I suppose it's probably pretty constant. And I think that's not a very good answer, but it's a very tough question.
A lot of people are jumping on board to making little stories up out of your paintings.
Ah, good.
So, Judy Keane says, I hope you don't cover up the woman by the tree.
Oh, the woman by the tree. Poor girl. They came and took her away over the night. It's unfortunate. It happens.
Sarah Jean says, I think the tower is where Johansson's wife bakes the bread.
Oh, that could well be. Johansson doesn't work, so somebody has to make the bread. I know that Sarah Jean's with another friend, and they are sitting on a couch, and they have popcorn. And I'll be dealing with them when I get back to my studio. I commend you all for not asking me continually what color that is. It's the instructor's nightmare, because I just make them and I don't necessarily think about them, which sometimes is evident when you look at my work. Here, by making the darks, I'm allowing the lights that were there already to become the trees. There's a little tree here, so we'll give it a side. These dark areas will explain themselves a little bit more when I've started putting some light in.
Deirdre Walsh has said that she's watching from County Mayo in Ireland. And she says it thinks it's Shan Valley, Cahill in Mayo.
Ah, indeed. And she ought to know. Deirdre was, for the Irish workshop last April, was someone I knew only from Instagram. And when I first got there a few days early, in order to find where I wanted everyone to paint, volunteered to show me all the secret spots that she as a painter had found, which was tremendously generous. And we drove around, spending a great deal of time, two complete strangers laughing. And so we have become great buddies since then. Although I can't explain it, she has a friend named Peter. Less said about the better. There's going to have to be a shadow along here ultimately. I'm not worrying about it at the moment.
We have a full story from Sheila Horvitz. She says the white area is the ruin of an ice house. While now the mountain is not covered with a glacier, it was through the 1940s. Local cutters used to hew huge blocks off the glacier, and they were brought down the mountain via oxen teams. The ice was packed in the ice house in sawdust until enough was collected. Then it was shipped downstream in small barges for sale in the cities. When refrigeration became widespread, the ice company went out of business, and the ice house fell into ruin.
There you are. What more do we need to know, right? This is what I do, not as completely as that when I'm just painting by myself. I generally don't do it out loud, because if someone comes in the studio, it seems very peculiar. But that's the sort of imagination I want. And we all, to some extent, though we may not use it, have that kind of imagination. Certainly when I was small, I remember being given pots and pans to play with on the kitchen floor, and I didn't object at all to the fact that they weren't really firehouses or various other things. I just made them into that. And I do think that one of the best things for children is to give them something that they can make into whatever they like, rather than having something that's already decided for them. But that's probably just me being old and cranky. But we all have lots of stories, and we have, particularly when we're children, have great imaginations until ordinary life rather talks us out of doing that. And those of us who keep it and can still play make-believe often become artists. Those of you watching from the UK know that Joe, the cameraman, is from Leicestershire, just by listening. We all know about negative shapes. What we're going to do here is make those reflections by using negative shapes, so that whatever that thing is, it's going to have its reflection just because I didn't paint anything there. Now I just painted over it because I wasn't paying attention, so we'll have to take that out. Thank you. One person I heard from before we started yesterday was going to be painting along at home. Maybe find out if anyone else is doing that, and how difficult that may be if I keep changing it.
Laurie Hellowell's asked, she would appreciate hearing more about your thought process as you begin a new painting. Do you have some idea of what you will be creating? Do you at least make a decision about whether it will be an interior or a seascape or mountainscape, so that you will know what type of shapes to begin with?
In that largest sense, interior, mountainscape, seascape, yes, I do. I paint the sea with some regularity on small paintings, actually at the sea. If I'm doing an interior, it's a much more disciplined thing, because everything's got to be believable and people can in fact check it, whereas people can't check whether those trees are right other than the fact that they look like trees. But if I make a door frame that's all cockeyed, it's immediately apparent. So in that case, that process is different, and I know I'm going to do an interior ahead of time. If I'm doing a landscape other than, and not a seascape, I rarely have any idea what I'm doing when I start. Sometimes I have no idea what I did when I finish, but it's, you just need to give a little rein to your imagination, and if you can come close to convincing yourself that something is the case in the painting, most sympathetic viewers will go along with you. Pretty soon we're going to have to put some real paint on here. I don't know what this thing is, but I rather like it. It does have one dark side there. Accidents will happen. I'm not going to do this, but because of the way I put the brush strokes there, my imagination might say, well, that could be just a wood fence that I could then actually make into a wood fence, but we're not going to do that. But it's my seeing things like that as I go, and I say, oh, that could be a whatever, and next to a whatever there ought to be a thingamajig. So then, now, I'm going to clean this a little bit, and I'm going to use brownish madder, which some of you know is a favorite color of mine. It's a Rembrandt color. It's not unlike alizarin, but it's much warmer. I use it a lot to describe the glow that comes in shadows in sunlight, from the reflected light coming up off the ground into the shadow. And of course, in this case, I'm painting the reflected light from the light I haven't yet put in. I think if this is going to be the ice house, I'm easily led. If this is going to be the ice house, we're not going to know it's an ice house unless we're local, but it's just going to be an old masonry structure of some sort. And if that's the case, then I think I'm going to light it from this side, and so part of this side is going to be somewhat in shadow. We'll get to the light part later. Maybe we should juice this up with some light right now to get it going. So, let us see. You may have noticed that I have not now in 4 hours gone anywhere near my white paint, or for that matter, any opaque paint. But now the time may have arrived. So we'll set the key. I'm going to take a little bit of flake white. Remember, if you use flake white, it has lots of wonderful qualities, but you must be scrupulous in your studio hygiene. Make sure that you wash your hands before you have your muffin or whatever you're going to have, because it is trying very hard to kill you. So here's a sort of a peachy color. And I'm going to put some right along there. And so you can see just with that little line, a great deal of light came out. Some yellow ochre in that, a little bit of vermilion. Although it's opaque, I'm sort of scumbling it over the top just to give it a little undercolor for the moment as I begin to figure out what the light pattern of this is going to be. Remember that flashlight's up here someplace? Very definitely we're going to get some of that down, whoops, a little too much, down here in the water. I don't think so much about warm and cool when I paint, or at least it doesn't come up to my consciousness. And everyone is always saying, oh, you want to balance that with or whatever. And I guess I do, but I don't think about it in quite those terms. Cadmium green light, my one cadmium color. I don't know if you heard yesterday or if I said that I don't keep other cadmiums because, especially on a small palette like this, I don't think they play well with others. And I wind up using too much of the space trying to control them. Plus, when I started, cadmium colors were too expensive, and so that wasn't even really a choice. They're still expensive, but I occasionally now sell a painting, which makes a difference. I don't think I like that color very much, but remember that we're counting on all those little marks we made before, to some of them to still be there, to give us a sense of texture without necessarily laboring putting it in. Let's think about some light on that tree trunk. What will we do? This is burnt umber with a little bit of red in it and some white. We'll use this now for the short term. That, even though it's not as warm a color, robs a lot of the impact of the ice house. So I've got to keep in mind that it wants to steal the show. We'll get some very dark things back in there to allow this tree to really stand out.
We've got a couple of questions. Sasha Nola has asked, can you say more about the retouch varnish? Do you give the whole painting a coat at the beginning of each session?
I'm sorry?
Do you give the whole painting a coat?
I generally tend to. I think if I were an illustrator, I would probably just do the part that I was going to work on that day. But because everything stays pretty active in my paintings, I usually give it a spritz all over.
I've actually got two of the same question, which is about using the fact that you are using a white canvas. Do you ever use a toned canvas? I
almost invariably do, and I failed to tone this one. And I'm trying to pretend that I didn't want to, but I forgot to do it. For a long time, I would stretch canvases only as I needed a canvas, and because I wanted to work on it, I didn't tone them, because then it would just be wet and it would get in my way. If I plan ahead, I almost invariably tone them, and I tend to tone them either with transparent red oxide or with a blocks color which is called jaune capucine clair, so it would be capucine yellow light. It's a very pink color. Because I paint mostly landscapes, it's nice for me to have a warm reddish color to balance the greens.
Louise Dishard has asked, she is reviewing the book you published, Donald Jurney Selections from the French Sketchbooks. She says she imagines all that drawing outdoors has given you a wealth of knowledge to inform your imagined landscapes. Do you often revisit your sketches for inspiration before you begin a painting?
I do in the larger sense, just to remind me of the vocabulary, but I don't necessarily paint something from the sketch. That said, there's some sketches, because they don't have color in them and they don't have a lot of value shifts in them, that I can make a spring picture of or a summer picture of, different kinds of weather. And so in that sense, they have been very valuable to me. At one time, I painted a lot of paintings from them. I do go back and look at them and think about all the hours I spent trying to learn how to do this, and that there really was a benefit to it. I'll often say to students that in the wintertime, when they're bored, they can go off in the car someplace where they can, from the car, can draw bare trees so that they learn the anatomy of trees. And I think that's a valuable skill to come up with. Because of the time I would be traveling, for example, in France, almost invariably it was the time when the leaves were on the trees, so I didn't do a lot of that kind of drawing. But knowing the anatomy of trees, since they are the chief protagonists in our landscape, at least the consistently present ones, except for some places that are more barren. But knowing them and their personalities is an important thing. I have a tendency, now I'm saying this publicly, I have a tendency to paint the same trees. And I think once we're comfortable with something like that, we all do that. But it's certainly nice to shake it up. Corot, I think, said that if you're going to out in the middle of a field and there's a tree in the middle of it, that you shouldn't just paint the tree from that side, but in fact, before you start, you should walk all the way around it to see what's happening on the other side. I remember a student who was painting a tree, and it had what I call sky holes, where you can see through it. But you'd see the plane of the tree that was facing you, you would see the sky hole, and you would also see the inside of the far side of the tree. And many people don't think about the fact that part of what you see in that green mass is a different value because it is the inside of those leaves on the far side. The book that I did of maybe 100 of the French sketches you can find on blurb.com. I'm sorry to tell you that it's pretty expensive, but they get the money, I don't. So occasionally they have sales and you can get things for 30 or 40% off. You might find it valuable. You certainly can see that I spend an awful lot of time drawing. I do that, in fact, less now than I used to do. Not because I don't think it's valuable, but life seems to intervene sometimes. The top part of the ice house, unfortunately, has just gone away. I think the ice house needs to have some kind of something in it to make it more interesting. It wouldn't have a window as an ice house, so let's have a part that has sort of crumbled. So see, I keep going back and working on values in places, and I skip all over the place. Let's see. Yellow ochre and flake white. That's what happens when you try to drop the brush. we're going to get some light on this bank. I think I want it a little bit warmer than that. We can't really see what's happening outside the picture over here. So one of the things that we can do is have this light come in particular places and then give it a place to where it's not shining as a way of giving some variety rather than making the whole side be in light. There is that little section of light which in fact is coming behind this bush, and it's back here. And when it gets here, there's at least one trunk that gets lit by it. Now we're going to go to another color. This is cobalt, and I'm going to add to it a little bit of Old Holland violet gray, and I'm going to use that for this side of this, whatever it is, over here, because it's in shadow. If I do anything consistently, is I tend to go towards contrasting blues and oranges. There once was an essay written by an art historian in Georgia for a catalog of mine in which she identified that this is what I do, and I did not know that I did it until I read it. This reflection is going to be hard, just so you know ahead of time. Where I can, I try to get light things against dark things. I think we could have a little light that gets in here some way, and we don't have to explain how it gets there. We know that it's part of all that stuff that's coming from over there. The field up here, we can give a little more oomph to. So we make the field just continue by going along and finding some other little place where we want it to show through. That we can get to reflect a little bit. Even if it's not directly where it should be, the repetition of the color helps make it work better. Now I'm so starved for questions that I'll permit you to ask a really dumb question if you want. What you don't know at home is that there are people moving around in the space trying to distract me.
Leslie Hawes has asked, did you get your Guinness?
I did get the Guinness, thank you very much. It makes all the difference.
Lolly Shearer has asked, have you figured out what time of day it is yet?
Ah, well, maybe it's up to Lolly to figure out herself what time of day it is as I change the color, okay? And if you can't, Lolly, I haven't done it, so just telling you it won't work. Of your own? Yes?
Can you remember the first time that you ever painted from your imagination?
No. I can remember the first time I tried to paint in oil paint. I had the use of an easel. I had some old paint that had belonged, you know, the sort of thing that had belonged to somebody's grandmother and had been sitting in a sketch box for a long time. And it was of dubious value, but I didn't know that. And I was painting vertically on this, and I didn't know anything about medium. And I was trying to paint it with just turpentine to thin the paint. Well, you can imagine, since it was a vertical canvas, everything I painted just kept running down the front of it until there were as many tears running down my face as there were paint streams running down the canvas. And after that, I didn't know anybody to ask about any of this, so I just started painting in acrylic for a while, banished the word, and ultimately, a dear friend of mine, with whom I'm still friends, told me about mediums, and it was tremendously liberating. But no, I don't remember the first time from imagination. I mean, certainly that painting would have been from imagination, but I didn't have the kind of kit I could take outside. It did not, I'm sure, occur to me to paint from a photograph, not because I was being holier than thou, but it just I wouldn't have thought that. And so I'm sure I was just making up some Hudson River School that would have really embarrassed Frederick Church and John Kensett and all those guys. So, it may be disappointing to know that sometimes I take paint because it's closer to my brush than the other color I really should be taking. In this case, this is cobalt and alizarin, and I did not make a serious choice to use cobalt, but it was nearer my brush than the ultramarine was. Don't tell anyone. What I say here, Joe, is just secrets between us and the audience, right?
Yes.
It doesn't go. It doesn't leave this space. Thank you. I was just brought some coffee, and even more than Guinness, I run on coffee. So I run less than I used to. Because I can't hear all of you, I listen to see if Joe is laughing. And he's a good sport about what I say, which is nice. And so as I do this, all of a sudden, That light is nowhere near as light as I want it to be, but we'll get some paint in here. I'm sure when this class is done, this painting will be available in the school store, so if you had such a wonderful experience that you couldn't stand not to have it, don't you worry, we'll make you a deal you won't forget.
Question from Peter. Do you ever experiment or practice with other techniques, for example, cold wax medium?
I haven't. Someone gave me some Dorland's wax medium once and I tried to use it, and it cost me so much to try and learn how to paint the way I have that I felt like just couldn't start again, which is not a very good answer from an artist, but I was just amazed that I could get the sky at the top and the ground at the bottom, and I thought, let's not fool with this. We've got something going here. One of the people who's here today is a fellow named John Hayes that you guys may know from Instagram. John is teaching a workshop in Italy, and I would commend his instruction to you and tell you to sign up immediately. I think you'll have a great time. And you'll actually learn something. John was my monitor on a workshop in Norway, and his job really was to keep everyone in line and do the stuff I didn't want to do, which is what monitors are for. And from time to time he would start teaching people, and which was very good in one sense. On the other hand, since he was entirely contradicting what I was saying, it was less good. But I managed to have him rein that in, which is so. But I would suggest to you that you'll have a wonderful time if you go. You'll learn a lot. John's a nice fellow. He's more serious than I, which is probably good for you. And I think you'll like it a lot. For the person who wants to write in and say, are you painting that whole thing with the same brush? Well, a lot of it. And will I ever do the sky? I will, probably when Joe says to me, 20 minutes left. These divisions that I had, like that line right there between the light and the dark, I'm now going to somewhat remove by just dragging this lighter color, which is the Old Holland violet gray, over it, so that we can pretend that rather than a ridge with treetops, that in fact is just an area that the shadow is causing. We'll also have to go darker in here to let that work better. This orangey color I don't like. But first I'm going to get some more intense color than I think I would normally use on the flank of this mountain here, because in my mind that's turned away from us. When I do the sky, I'll have to soften this line that I left from yesterday. It's a reasonably strong line. We'll get this to meld all together for now. Depending on who you are and what you like, this time is going to be sort of the time when you say either let's have tea or it's about time for a drink. Or both, exactly. Perhaps you could have tea and a little sherry would be good. I'm not, of course, allowed to have any sherry while I do this, but
Check the mug.
he's checked the mug, exactly. It's a funny looking color of coffee. I've just dragged some cadmium green into that bluey violet color. I don't want it to be green nor entirely violet, so I'm just letting that knock down the strong color that I put on. It's kind of sad to hear that there's now still only one person who's watching, but that's not true. At least I hope that's not true.
A question from Lisa Downey has asked, would you be willing to share any artists or authors who you find most inspiring?
Ah, I probably would. I answered the question, didn't I? Well, are we talking about things to do with fine art in particular, or just generally?
I think generally.
Generally. Well, I read rather eclectically. Most recently, I read something which has no relationship to this, which is Nora Ephron's book Heartburn, which is a very funny book. There's a quote I'd like to share with you, but there may be small children listening, so I won't say it. But she's not typical of what I normally read. I do read a lot of poetry. Occasionally I write some poetry. There's no comparison between the poetry that I read and the poetry that I write, because the poetry that I write is not being done by a real poet. It makes a big difference. I'm a great fan of, I think I may have said yesterday, Wordsworth's Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey. I find that every time I read it, I find some other part that is tremendously interesting to me. I just started reading recently an omnibus volume of the poems of Pablo Neruda. I historically read a lot of nonfiction and biography. I sort of read all over the place. I tend to like, and someone in County Mayo will snicker, I tend to like really depressing novels about Ireland, which sounds very unkind. For anyone who's Irish who's listening, I apologize, but of course, on the other hand, you understand that better than anybody else. So that's starting to work a little bit there. I don't know what else I can tell you about that. It's probably because I'm concentrating on this. If I think of a bunch, I'll post them on Instagram. Of course, I look at art books all the time, and I'm always finding new artists that I've never heard of. And I'm astounded that, given the quality of their work, that I've never heard of them. But of course, as you know, a lot of our kind of painting went in the deep freeze for quite a long time, and it wasn't in people's consciousness. All these little lines are a little too insistent, so I'll take this with no paint on it and just make them a little less insistent, so they aren't quite so directional. Wherever I stop today, we're going to say it's done, but it's not really done. And I would historically go back and fiddle with it in little ways. I'll probably find inconsistencies about the light or in the kind of day. So I would go back and fix those. Now we need to get some more stuff down here. People often say, what color is the water? And of course the water is the color of whatever it's reflecting. Unless it's a very muddy river, it doesn't have a color of its own. Do we have any questions from anybody who's here? Isn't it amazing? And if you knew these people, you'd know that they rarely keep their traps shut. So it's a... There you go. Thanks for helping me out, guys. I thought at least there'd be something like, what are we having for dinner?
Herded food.
Yes. There is a little bit of a disjunct between the way I'm painting the water now and this bank, and I'm going to have to put part of that bank in shadow, but I'm not worrying about the contrast yet. What's interesting is to think that there are people in other parts of the world who are going to bed rather than staying up and watching the rest of this. I think that's sort of sad, don't you? What is that, you might ask? That is going to be a cast shadow on the water. So now I have to knock a lot of this down in value. This little sandy bank here is going to get smaller. And then I can light the top of these guys over here. I can find the color I want.
We have a question from Madeline.
Yes.
Which asks, did you ever quit the fear of painting?
Did I ever quit the fear?
Mm.
No, I find it terrifying still. And if I found it terrifying painting in my studio, I can tell you how terrifying it is painting in front of you guys. Additionally, among the audience here are some very good painters, and I would, if I knew now, or if I knew then what I know now, I wouldn't have been willing to paint in front of them. But it's rather late now. Fortunately, they don't paint so many landscapes, which is good. I don't think people should be encouraged to paint landscapes as long as I need to sell paintings. You won't like it, I promise. So there's some more light for a second there. That could be a little warmer, but we'll leave it that way for the moment.
A question from Laurie Halliwell. She's asking, do you have any advice about the business aspects of being an artist, or suggestions to those of us just starting out?
Well, there was a painter named Elmer Bischoff, who I think lived most of his career in the southwest of America, and he had a young child brought to him by the child's mother with the child's drawings to ask him if he thought this child should become an artist. And he said if there's anything else this child can do instead of being an artist, he should do that. If the child must be an artist, then there's nothing for us to discuss. So I would suggest to you that, except for a few meteors, it's really tough. It takes a long time. The good part is that you never get to the end of it. The bad part of it is there's always so much still to learn. So my advice is, certainly from my own experience, if you have some good years, make sure you save it, because the other kind will come soon enough. Which sounds a little depressing, doesn't it? But work very hard at your craft. Make sure that the people you're listening to are people whose opinions are valid and whose intention is to help you rather than just to sound important to themselves. Finding people that can give you a good opinion of things is very important, because particularly in the beginning you have no idea which ones are the good ones and which ones aren't. What else do I want to tell you? Don't worry about finding your own style or trying to create your own style. I promise you, your style will find you. Don't pay too much attention to the fact the dealer wants peonies and you want to paint tulips. If you like peonies, all right, then fine. If they leave you cold, then paint tulips. If you paint it well, it'll do just as well as the peonies. In case you don't know, this is gold, what I'm telling you.
Got a question from Sarah Brown. She says, how much does your technique alter when painting plein air, when you have less time for underlayers to dry, and what is the most important information you choose to select from a scene when there is limit?
It's certainly the grisaille. Making sure that where I paint, there's rarely a beach, and so in the foreground are rocks. I want to understand those rocks and define them well in grisaille. In terms of the water, I'm not so much a crashing wave painter, so the water forms are a little easier for me than for some, because I just need to have the sense of moving water rather than the specific character of particular waves. If I'm painting a landscape, again, you saw me, what I did yesterday. I got a lot of information down, and if all of a sudden it started to rain or did some other thing, or I had to be someplace, I have enough information then to make a place. If it's not a commission of Mrs. Smith's backyard, then the job really is for you to make a convincing place that first convinces you and then convinces others. So I put down as much information as I can, and if I'm by myself and not teaching in a class, I try to see how much I can get down before the urge to have a cup of coffee overwhelms me. And that's usually a couple of hours. Often I don't go back to the place again, so my memory of it and the information I put down become the basis for the painting that I subsequently make. In case you wondered, this tree is going to have a top. It's just not here at the moment. I think another thing when you're starting to think about is that if you don't have a lot of time, the way I didn't, to spend at painting, it became really important that every time you painted on your day off or whenever it was, that you come away with something. And it's heartbreaking because very rarely in the beginning do you come away with what you wanted to come away with. And it's so easy to become discouraged. Just remember, every one of these times is contributing to the information and the knowledge on which you will build later on. So don't get too concerned about quote unquote wasting time, because you're not. Don't expect, particularly on a workshop, don't expect to come back with 6 paintings that are going to astound and amaze your friends when you get home. That's not the point of it. The point of it is to learn. I've had some great workshop experiences, and invariably I learned something from each of the students. Not always necessarily positive things, but things that I want to think about. And so that old thing about teachers learning from their students is really true. I do know, having not really had a teacher, that it would be great to be able to ask lots of questions that someone might answer in a minute. There were things that, when I was starting, it took me forever to figure out, which somebody could have told me in an afternoon. And but there, in my particular situation, I couldn't find anybody to do that. It's possible that they were there and they knew I was there and they just didn't want to do that for me. But there was a man named John Helliker who was a member of the National Academy and had a retrospective at the Whitney in the early 70s. He started as a reasonably representational painter, wound up being somewhat abstract, and then moved back to being somewhere in between. A lot of figurative painting, figures and interiors. And he was a friend of friends, and I was very much in awe of the fact that he was having a career that was, you know, that I couldn't imagine having. And my friends spoke to him, and all of a sudden, for the length of a winter, I had the use of a studio he was not using, and it was just the most remarkably freeing thing. It became sort of ugly when I refused to return the studio to him. But he has now gone to his great reward, and I hope that he's being rewarded for looking out for young artists. The friends of mine who knew him would bring his mother back from Maine to New York at the end of every summer. And John had gotten through 8th grade, but that was the extent of his formal education. He then went on to win a Guggenheim, a Prix de Rome, had this retrospective at the Whitney, was a member of the National Academy, was a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And one summer, my other friends were bringing his mother home, and she said, "I just wish he'd finished school." It shows you that you can learn lots of things whether or not you're in school. And he certainly did what he chose to do very well.
From Tatiana Kalida. She says, greetings, many thanks for inspiration and wisdom. It is Monday morning and it's 7 a.m. She's watching from New Zealand.
Wow.
She says, it seems that you have used transparent pigments for the underpainting yesterday and are continuing to use transparent colours for your shadows. Are you thinking about form and opacity versus atmosphere in choosing your colours/pigments?
Oh, Tatiana, I don't know the answer to that question. I would like to say to you, and it would sound like I'm being silly, but I haven't any idea what I'm doing. But I make choices, and they don't necessarily percolate up to the level of my being able to enunciate them to you. So if I think back, I certainly am trying to keep things as transparent as I can in areas that will sustain that. In areas that require a little more opacity, then I have to figure out how I'm going to do that and how that's going to work with the more transparent colors near them. Right now, I'm doing an age-old technique because I want this to be sort of grassy. So the often underappreciated other end of the brush does a good job of that. If I had another day with this, probably on top of this, I would lay a veil or a glaze of transparent yellow oxide. But I can't do that when it's this wet. So here is some of the brownish matter, and I'm going to put it on the underneath side of this tree. Or these trees, because they are getting light that's bouncing off the top of this and bouncing in their direction, in addition to the fact that the light is going this way. It enables me to give it a little more richness in there. We can also do that in some other places. Sometimes we can have the residue of a light effect, like this reflected light, in a place where we haven't entirely given them the information to know where the light is coming from, and just the reflected light that we put in rather answers the question. When it bounces up off this grass here underneath this bush, it gets very red, particularly at this time of the day. I think it's remarkable that Tatiana is in a whole nother day. And although I understand the concept, my mind still has trouble getting around it. I'm still struck by how quiet some of the people are here where I'm painting. And only a couple of them are actually asleep, which is good. No one's snoring. These are not people who are quiet by nature. The line I make for that shadow is, of course, a made-up line, but it tells us what that ground is doing. I'm hoping, Joe, you're going to say George Innes from Montclair, New Jersey would like to know how you're doing that. I had a very strange experience when I first started painting, and I was still working in the lumber yard. And one of the people who was a customer there was a guy about my own age, and that would have been early 30s. And he worked in finance in New York, and we became sort of friendly as I would help him with his home renovation project. And at some stage I finally said, why don't you and your wife come for dinner? And so they came. And he didn't know much about me, nor he. And so they were there for dinner, and I had another couple there who I knew very well. And it came out during dinner that he is apparently psychic, which occurred to me, if he's in the world of finance, that might very well help. But we said to him afterwards, we said, why don't you just tell us something? And he was willing to do that. And so in turn, he took each of our hand in his, and he didn't really read our palm, but he was clearly attempting to come up with some sort of vibration from us. And the first person he spoke to was the woman I was then dating, and he told her that essentially that she was going to become a Wall Street star. And at that particular time, that was rather difficult to imagine. And she subsequently did. She went to business school. She wound up being one of the first women with an important position on Wall Street. And that was rather startling, but we didn't know how good that was then. The husband of the other couple that I knew, he says to this guy, are you still having terrible leg cramps at night? And I'm thinking, whoa. And so I knew this guy pretty well. In fact, we had shared a house. And my friend said, no, they've gotten better, thank you. And I'm thinking, how creepy is that? He's never met this guy. And so then he looks at me and he says, did you know that there are dead painters trying to finish their work through you? And even when I tell you that now, I get goosebumps. Anyway, I don't think that's true. At least I hope that's not true. I hope I'm not doing their work. I have enough work of my own to do. It's sort of, you had your chance, right? But if ever you see a little John Kensett or something like that, you know that, in fact, I'm doing his work. Depending, if I lived someplace in the UK, I could say, this part is very muddy. But I don't know what I'm going to do about that. Trying to get that tower to separate itself is hard for me. If you're doing it at home, it won't be any problem. But how we get the ice there? Though, of course, if the river's frozen...
Oxen.
Oxen, yes. Mm-hmm. What was the name of Paul Bunyan's ox? Blue. Babe? Blue? Blue? So you say, okay, Blue, go out there and see how strong it is. Blue, oh, Blue oxen. But the name was Babe? Yeah. Okay. See, now look at that. They perk up when there's something intellectual.
Do you have a favorite color?
I do.
What is it?
Yellow.
Wow.
No, that's not answerable. No. Or I'm not answering it, maybe.
There you go.
No, I've painted many rooms yellow. And I think it's just because it's so optimistic. It tends to be a warmer yellow, not so much lemon yellow. I'm not so keen on that. Joe, tell me about my time.
You have just under 1 hour.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question.
Of your own?
Of my own.
Mm-hmm.
It seems, and I could be wrong, but it seems like you have a very good grasp of geography and what happens, because I think it's kind of been confirmed by the fact that everyone says it looks like someone near them. Is that through experience of painting outside? Is that through studying it? What would you...
Certainly not through studying it in the sense of studying geography. The one thing we painters have in a better supply than most lay people is that we have looked more and we understand perhaps a little bit more from having looked a lot. And as long as we can keep them ignorant, we can sell paintings. But as soon as they know as much as we should know, they'll find the faults in our work. But most people don't really look at the landscapes. They think, oh, isn't that beautiful? And then they're on their way someplace else. So that as long as we come close to it, and particularly if we come close to the poetry of it, most viewers are willing to go along with it. I don't think that answers your question, but there you go. You also see that unlike the window shade painters, and for those of you who don't know, there's people who start paintings, let's say at the top, and they entirely finish them as they go down, and there'll be a whole blank area under where they've done the most minute detail. Whereas I paint all over the place, as you can see. I can't imagine finishing a painting as I went because, well, as you've seen from this demonstration, I don't have the faintest idea what it's going to look like, which doesn't help. I did not intend this little dark spot here, and I like it a lot, so I'm going to let it be there and have the area right above it be lit. What are we going to do with this dog's dinner down here? Question time.
Bruce has literally just a message saying, maybe it's just me, but now the structure seems to have come forward and now appears to be only 3 to 4 feet tall. Did you do that on purpose?
Well, I would have, in order to answer that I had done it on purpose or not, I would have to agree with his assessment, right? I think it's taller than 4 feet tall. I think it's about 18.5 feet tall. And I'm, of course, the only one who really gets to have an opinion, right? I did not intend to make it smaller, and but stuff like that happens, considering the fact that we didn't even know it was an ice house till a little while ago. That was not meant to be unfair to Bruce. It was meant that you guys know by now I don't have the faintest idea what I'm doing until I've done it. I think about Rubens having Van Dyke as his studio assistant. Wouldn't that be cool? You would love my older pieces. That's if Van Dyke was drawing them.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
What made you leave the lumberyard?
I mean, was my fascination for lumberyard only just that small?
Well, what changed? Did you become successful?
I left the lumberyard and thought I'd become a painter. I was telling yesterday, and and I had got myself an exhibition, and I had 2 months to learn how to paint. And because I kept the prices lower than a good meal, I managed to sell the paintings. And but it was at a time when I had no money in the bank, and there was no way I could justify quitting my job, and I really didn't know how to paint, so I quit, which hardly makes any sense. But as I said yesterday, the man for whom I worked was fired very unreasonably, and so I could say to myself that I was quitting on principle, though I did know I was quitting to paint. But if I finally said, oh, I have to do X or Y or Z before I can just become a painter, I never would have done it. So it was my good fortune and his less good fortune that he was fired. People supported me a lot at that first show, which I talked about yesterday, and were tremendously kind to me. So no, I had no interest in the lumberyard. It was the last of a whole group of not very interesting jobs. I had fun, and it enabled me to learn a good bit, which helped me when I was subsequently renovating things, but it was not really the place for me. Sometimes you just got to do it. The very worst thing that can happen is that I would run out of money not having a job. But I was so scared that I learned some of the basics of painting reasonably quickly because I knew what the downside was.
Bruce has just added that, however tall, he forgot to mention that he loves it either way. So
oh, thank you, Bruce. Now you may come to the studio then.
Question from Leslie Hawes. She says, in your earlier career, did you seek gallery representation, or did a gallery approach you?
Leslie, I was very fortunate, and it's possible you'll hate me for this, but I'll tell you anyway. There was a gallery in New York at that time that had a woman there as an assistant, and I sent her some slides or something, and she asked me to bring in some work. So I was really excited. I lived about an hour and a half north of New York, and I drove to New York with all these pictures in a cardboard box. None of them was very big, and so excited I was going to have a chance to show this work to this woman on Madison Avenue. And All of the frames were probably ones that I got at tag sales, or what some people call car boot sales. And so they were all different one from another. Probably a number of times I had cut the painting because I had the frame and we just made it fit. And I know none of you has ever done that. But so I get there and I take the pictures up, and she's on the telephone and she waves for me to come into this office and to put them down along the wall, along the floor. So I do that, and she's still talking on the phone. And she winds up putting her hand over the mouthpiece of the phone, looking at me and saying, "Thanks, I don't think so, thank you." And so all of a sudden I was back on the street with my box of paintings, and it wouldn't be true if I didn't tell you that I was almost immediately in tears standing on this street because I invested so much in this and she had been such a jerk about the way she had dealt with me. It wasn't her responsibility to like my work, but it was her responsibility to be a little bit nicer than that. Anyway, so I didn't know what to do. So I walked down to 57th Street, and there was then a small gallery called Tetistchev, run by a Russian émigré, and it was a very small space. So I went up there with my my box of paintings, and I was talking to him, and he said to me, well, what we could do is, he said, I could take them for 6 months, and we'll see what people like or don't like, and then we can go from there. So all of a sudden I had something that was tremendously exciting. So I did that, and we're talking about that, and I think I'm probably giving him my information. And in comes Steve Doherty, who was then the editor of American Artist. And he was bringing some copies of the magazine in which one of Peter Tetistchev's artists was featured. So he and I got talking, and he asked me about my contact information, and I thought that was kind of strange. And then I got a call from him asking me if I would like to have an article in American Artist. So I'm thinking, is this the strangest day I've ever had in my life? And so he arranges for this fellow who then worked at Spanierman in New York, named Eric Whiting, to come interview me. And all of a sudden, this was maybe February, all of a sudden in November I was going to have this article. So I thought, how cool is that? Even though I actually didn't really know how to paint. But they'd been through all of the other people who were possible choices. So the day the guy comes to interview me, about, I should say, about an hour and a half north of New York, I opened a letter from John Pence, who then had probably the premier realist gallery in America and in San Francisco. One of my friends, without telling me, had taken my slides to him, and they didn't tell me because they didn't want me to be crushed if nothing happened. And there was a letter from John saying, would you be interested in having a one-man show in November? And I'm thinking, oh yeah, sure. I'm having a magazine article. Why not have the show? And so all of a sudden my world turned around in a minute. And none of it was really because I did anything. So it's possible there's somebody out there working on your behalf right now, and it's a good idea to be nice to people. It's certainly a good idea to be a lot nicer than that woman in that gallery was to me. But you sort of never know what's going to happen. And part of it's what you're doing at the easel, part of it's being in touch as much as you can with what's happening in the art world, and particularly in your area. And remember, if you're just starting out, this is not the time to be comparing yourself to the great masters of what you do, because you're just starting out. So don't chase fads to the extent that you can avoid it, because that fad is going to be gone in a minute. And if you have too much invested in it and too many people think that's what you do, you'll be in a mess. And I don't know what else to tell you. It's tough. It never gets easier. You'll have periods in which you think, this is so easy. And times when you think to yourself, when was the last time I sold a painting? And that doesn't go away. I promise you that part. So always keep your eyes peeled. Keep close fellow artists and collectors to the extent that you can, who support you, because you'll need them when things aren't so good. Not so much because they're going to buy paintings, but because they're there to support you when you need it. And it's the most rewarding thing I can imagine having done. At times it has been just excruciatingly awful in terms of pressure and in terms of studio loneliness and all kinds of things. Because even your best artist friends only partly understand what it is you're trying to do. So there's a good bit of loneliness in it. So choose your artist friends well. Be honest with them when they ask you about their work and expect that from them. If you think they're motivated by a competitive streak, find some other friends, because you don't need that from your friend. And I think here endeth the morning lesson. Now, as you can see, I'm sort of tickling. Now is when I will change color temperatures a lot.
I have a question from Beth Badger. She says she's on a bus to Boston watching part 2 of your live stream. Hooray for internet. She'd like to ask a question. Your paintings always have such an aura and luminosity and rarely have figures in the landscape. Do you have any perspective on that genre or periods in which you have painted the figure or figures in the landscape?
I've done it very few times. I do it really poorly. If they don't get more than about half an inch tall, I can get away with it. As soon as they're larger than that, it's apparent how ill-drawn they are and how little I understand about figure painting. When I started, I went to the League in New York, and I was commuting there just as I was to that gallery, and the instructor was there 2 afternoons a week. He never spoke to me, and I just couldn't sustain it financially and in terms of time. And so I'm not properly trained in the figure. And when you get to a certain bit of stage, when people say, well, you know, that guy can paint a tree, it's very hard sometimes to go back to being the beginning art student. And so part of it's that I didn't want to go back and make bad figures in front of people, which is a pretty honest answer for you. I occasionally will do a really bad portrait head, and I'll be all excited about it, and then I'll realize that the whole thing is just awful, and so they get wiped out. And usually there are trees that appear on them afterwards. Though that said, all of the great artists, whether or not they chose to do so, could in fact do it all. So I think that gives us a sense of where I fall in this. Time, Joe?
You got about 37 minutes left.
Ah. So I'm not going to be able to avoid the sky much longer, right?
Not really, no.
I have not had a sip of this coffee. I would probably, if I had longer with this, keep punching up the light on the warm light on the sides of these things. I think it might be fun to have a little light right there where the broken part is. I don't know if I ever told you what this is, but I don't know what it is now. But people that came to that very first show, and when I really didn't know what I was doing, bought almost all the pictures, but they were like $50, and so it wasn't a big expense for these people, and they just sort of wanted to help me out. About 10 years later, I had a show at that particular art association, and I decided to give a catered dinner for about 8 of the couples, and this was a huge expense for me. At the time it was about $1,000, and I'm not even sure where I got the $1,000 from, but I invited these people, and they came on the Friday night before the Saturday opening for a private party, and they got to see all of the show and whatever. And for it, I painted like a 2-inch by 3-inch or something like that landscape, which I then framed and put on an easel as a party favor at each one of the places of the wives. And so everybody had something to go away. And this was really a dinner to thank them for what they'd done at a critical time. And everybody had a good time. And to my great delight, some of them went around and bought some of the paintings that were going to be opening the next day. But it was really nice, and people really appreciated being thanked for their help, and the fact that an artist, of all people, we not known for our social skills, would remember that they had tried to play a part when it was really critical. So you might think about that as something you might do to thank people who were instrumental in getting it going. And if you're going to give away favors like that, you certainly can invite me, and I would be happy to have one of your paintings. Now, when I said that this painting would be available in the school store, you must understand that it'll only be as far as I've taken it, so you'll have to finish the rest of it at home. But having seen what I've been doing, you probably know how to finish it, so. Joe, I'm expecting you to tell me there's a question that says, what is the school store?
You can answer anyway.
The school store is where you can buy this painting. Don't think I like that color, or it's that I don't like this color in here. Remind me, I'm supposed to do the sky, okay?
20 minutes out, right?
Ooh, 20 minutes.
Not yet, no.
Oh,
Do you want me to remind you?
yes, that's good, thank you.
Don't get excited. Yeah.
Stephanie Neely says, the painting is still working wonderfully.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Has a very mysterious end of the day feeling, seems like just before sunset.
Ah, now, come on. Stephanie is somebody who bought a small painting of mine, not knowing me and not having seen the picture live, from my Instagram feed. And I was very thrilled that she had done it. And Stephanie is a good painter herself, paints very differently than I, but it's particularly nice when paintings are bought by artists who ought to know better. So now I'm going to go from how much time to, how long till 20 minutes?
10 minutes or 20.
Okay. I'm sure somebody wants to know how tired I am. I'm really tired. No? No one cares, do they? No, exactly right. I paid you, get over it. In career things, it's really hard. Try and see if you can find a dealer who doesn't tell you what to paint, but a dealer who tells you a good bit about the reaction to those things you have painted so that you can make up your own mind about what you're doing. I had a dealer once, when I painted my first painting in France, sold it and said, very nice, but don't send me any more French pictures. And then I spent the next 15 years painting only France, and she did very well with it, so there you are. Dealers generally want more of the thing they just sold, which can ultimately be very defeating. We were going to put some light up here.
So we have a question from Lindsay Frost. She says, thank you so much for sharing this process and your mastery with us. This painting is absolutely rich and beautiful. Could you talk a little about your studio practices, such as daily routine, how and with what you prime your canvases, brush care, even though the one may be sketchy, framing, etc. Please come to upstate New York.
Where upstate? Does she? Maybe she'll tell us. My brush cleaning is very rudimentary, and most people don't approve of it. I wipe them at the end of the session. I put them in a thing of paint thinner, swish them around, wipe them again, then put them in another container of cleaner paint thinner, and that's it, which is why I wind up with these wonderful brushes that are as hard as a rock. It's the approved way to get those kind of brushes, and you probably shouldn't do that. Most people wash their brushes. When I was at the Art Students League, everyone did it, and we were painting with filberts. And of course, I was having great trouble controlling anything, and so I would wash them with soap, and they would, to me, go incredibly limp, which was not helpful to me. So anyway, this is why I wash them this way. And I do it that way because they die sooner, and I can send more money to Rosemary and Company. And what else did we have? We had primed canvases. I buy my canvas primed, so it's Clausen's number 13 single prime canvas, so I don't have to prime them. I do my own stretching, though I find that even less congenial as I get older. And I've stretched so many that I tend to get cranky. But I do that myself. My studio practice normally is I go to the studio every day as my default. Sometimes it's very short if there's something else on the agenda, but it's my go-to way of doing things. My door is always open in my studio building, which is an old mill, and it's filled with, among other things, lots of artists. And so I have lots of people come by to say hello, and I'm notorious for stopping what I'm doing to talk to them because it means I can have another cup of coffee, and then they go off, and I think to myself, now where was I? But for me, it's very important to have that collegiality, and we're all bringing new ideas to it. Even when we're not really discussing art by example, we're showing other choices that could be made. And I'm sure I exhausted all those questions, did I? Good. And did we get an answer about where in upstate New York?
Not yet.
Okay. When I worked at the lumberyard and wanted to be an artist, I lived very near a maximum security prison, and I thought that was rather a metaphor for my life at the time. So it was a nice lumberyard. Still, it was not the work I wanted to do. One question people are always asking is, when is the picture done? That's a hard one, and of course only you can decide that. Often your friends will say, stop, stop, and they're right, and then there's always the time when they're not right. So you really have to suit yourself. This is going to be done because it's going to be 4 o'clock. but that's not a good way to do it, because, I mean, especially if you got to the studio at 2 in the afternoon, being done at 4 o'clock isn't going to work. Are you watching for my sky time? Good.
Lindsay Frost, she's answered, I can't pronounce it. Rensselaer County?
Oh, Rensselaer, yes. Mm-hmm.
Sand Lake, New York.
Aha. Well, that's possible. That's possible. I did teach a couple of years ago in Toronto, and Rensselaer County is much closer. So it's up to her to entice me there with extraordinary artists who are dying for my help. And invariably, I will go where I'm led as long as people can come up with a group.
Sasha Knowles asked, do you dream about these places at night? And do these places inspire your poetry?
Sometimes, or maybe it goes the other way around. I don't share my poetry with very many people, and that's at their request. But exactly right. They don't wish it, so so maybe I sometimes paint it, but I may not know. In fact, I'm painting it at the time. But certainly the same things I think about in poetry are very much the same sort of things that I paint. Sky time?
You got like 22 minutes, so may as well be.
Huh. Yes. Huh.
Depends how big the sky wants to be.
Well, I can use part of the time by cleaning this palette up a little bit, because I don't want all of this junk in the sky. So, if I had a monitor, this would just be done. It's so hard to get a good monitor these days. Well, especially because their pay, you see, is the instruction. And if they've been with you before, they know the quality of the instruction, and so it's hard to get people.
Madeline Morch said, congratulations, I'm so impressed. Everything you do is so nice.
Isn't that lovely?
She says, sorry for my English, love from Italy-Denmark. So,
wow.
I don't know if there's 2 people watching or...
That's wonderful. Certainly a lot better than my Danish. But thank you very much. It's because I joke a lot with you, I think that you might think that I don't take painting very seriously. I really joke with you because I take it so seriously. And I have to keep myself a little bit lighter when I do this. But for me, it's the most serious thing that I do, and it's integral to who I am. But sometimes I get overwhelmed with the complexity of it and all of the choices and whatever, and so it's my nature then to make a joke about it. But I do take it very seriously. That's a dirty brush. You can tell if it's a dirty brush if you take it and run it across your hand and there's paint there. This one, on the other hand, is also a dirty brush. Where did I put the clean one I was just going to use? That's as hard as a rock. Oh, that's much better. Pardon me? Thank you. No, no, I can do it with this. Thank you. I want this to be warmer up here, but I'm going to play with the sky first. When I started painting, I used flake white, and then everyone told me how I couldn't do that because I was going to kill myself. Now, it's probably not the thing that's going to get me, so I use it. Your bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich is not better with flake white on it. Wash your hands. We're not going to get so far with the sky, but I can't remember who's buying my painting. Whoever it was that was buying my painting from the school store could do that when they get it home. If I were going to continue working on this with you guys, I would ultimately deepen the contrast in this painting. Here, where there's not much paint on it, I would define it a little better than it is now. Don't worry too much about the abrupt changes in these values and colors here. We're going to fix that in a minute. Remember, whether you're painting out of doors or painting out of your head, you're the only person who is there, so you're the only person who knows what it looks like. Make something that works well within itself, and it will get you through.
Question from Simon. How many paintings did you paint for your first show?
There were maybe 40, but some of them were as small as a playing card. And because they weren't very good, they didn't take very long. But that was about how many. And I was able to, actually that's the first show after I quit my job. Before that, I had a little show of about 15 paintings. And there, certainly the most expensive one was $50. And from that, I was able to buy a Hudson River School painting book, which I really wanted. My then girlfriend had a fit that I had spent money on this book, and I kept trying to explain to her that I needed this information in order to carry on. What I didn't realize at the time was that she didn't particularly want me to carry on. So the book galled her more than it might have done someone else. So I'm just taking this and I am dragging this through here. So it's taking a little bit of the previous color and softening it. So we want, how much time, Joe?
17 minutes.
Oh, rats.
Good or bad?
Well, I did say I was tired, didn't I?
Yeah.
Everybody at home should know that I was told, if necessary, I could stop early, and I want you to appreciate the fact that I didn't.
Question from Peter. He says, I've been amazed by your imaginary interiors that you post on Facebook. Which do you find more enjoyable to paint, interiors or landscapes?
I very much enjoy the interiors, and they are invariably entirely made up, which is fun for me. I think deep inside me there's an interior designer trying to get out. So they're fun because I can make up a place from scratch. I do them often in reaction to having painted a lot of landscapes and wanting a break, as somebody else might do then a figure painting or whatever. I think essentially I remain a landscape painter, but I very much enjoy doing the interiors. They are in many ways, if you know them, also very large still life, because I put a lot of still life elements into them. Right now I'm just doing some contrast. This has lots of refinement that could be done to it, but I would certainly not paint it 3 hours at a time. If I were doing it in my studio, there'd be a little more time for reflection in between. But I was told that if I started reflecting and, and didn't talk, you weren't going to like it, so here I am. It's not a race. The goal is to make good paintings. If you're a slow painter, that's great. If you're a fast painter, that's great too, but make sure that you're not being fast just to be fast. That gives that a little more oomph over there. I don't like the color of that green, so what will I do to it? I don't really want to put this very strong yellow in it, but I want something like that, but we'll see. This was going to have light up there, wasn't it? So we got to get something over here in the back. This morning I volunteered to taste something that my hosts have, which is something that's made out of vegetables and is very green and is now in a powder, and you put it with some liquid. And I want to recommend it to you all. I feel just in these few hours it's changed my life. I don't know what it's called, but that's probably available in the school store too, so that's fine.
Leslie Hawes says, thank you. It's been an absolute delight to watch your process. You have boosted my confidence, and Le Queen will be my new secret weapon.
Wonderful. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you for being such a consistent follower on Instagram and not being judgmental when I fail.
So you've got about 10 minutes left, Don. If
Thank
anyone
you.
has any questions, you've got 10 minutes left to
Great.
submit them.
So then we, as children would say, we have to say, like a rubber band, make it snappy, right? What do we call a rubber band in England, John? An elastic band? Yeah. Well, I'm sure you can see all the places that need improvement. And on the one hand, I wish I had more time. On the other hand, if I had more time, I'd fall over right now. So we could do another 10 sessions on this. Just let me know.
Question from Marilyn Brandenberger. She says, will you continue to work on this painting after you get back to your studio?
That's going to sort of depend on what happens in the school store, I think. I might very well. I do have a number of paintings that are at this stage. Sometimes I get back to them. It's sometimes good if I don't know what to paint. I start painting on a painting I've worked on before as a way of just getting back into it. So I might very well work on it some more. A little brownish matter here because the light is bouncing up off this beachy thing and creating a certain amount of warmth there. This itself could have a little more warmth in it. At a certain stage, I'll have to determine whether this is an exercise or it's a painting.
Deborah Baker, she says, this is Deborah at Elysium. Have enjoyed watching your 6 hours of painting. Thank you for sharing your talent with us.
Well, thank you, Elysium, for sharing so much stuff with us on Instagram. It's a wonderful feed that all of you should follow. It's ELESIUM. And thank you for coming by to see this.
Bruce Erickson says, thank you so very much. Very, very inspirational for me.
Well, that's very nice. Thank you. Don't like that color. It's getting late. I like that better. If you guys don't know Fritz Taulow, T-H-A-U-L-O-W, Norwegian painter, painted in France, among others, friend of Monet. He was the reason Monet went to Norway to paint. Is somebody who does moving water so brilliantly that it's a great place for you to look if you want some inspiration. As you can see, I didn't learn anything from him, but it's just the way it is. I'm quitting, Joe. Yep. Thank you all very much. I would like to particularly thank my hosts, Louis Carr, Michael Klein, Alex Venezia, who is here, his lovely wife, Divya. I want to thank Parisa, Louis' wife. It's been a wonderful experience. I've been treated really well, other than the green powder, and we've had a wonderful time. Thank you.